Hello and welcome to Lesson 10 of our course, Reawaken the Dream, a course for the writer mom or anyone who is stuck writing in tiny fragments of time where you want to deal with the challenges that you face in that connecting your writing together and getting your emotions going between fragmented writing sessions. Delighted to have you today. We're going to be picking up with our 5th character trait. We're on the series on our character traits where we learn how to handle in our stories the struggles that are common to the human condition. We're in the process of building our 2nd very practical tool, the character profile, and it's going to give us the power of living characters so we can wake up our writing the moment we sit down to write. Let's take just a brief moment to review what we learned in the last lesson. The last time we took a look at the responsibility as a character trait. And responsibility, we compared that to constancy, the one before that. Constancy was adhering to the plans that we set out for ourselves, the goals we made for ourselves. Responsibility is similar, but it has to do with the promises that we made to others, the commitments we made to others, following through with that, and also the flip side of taking responsibility for our words and actions, even when they did not come out the way we had hoped. We looked at the animal model of the struggle, which was the dog defending its food. But we were wondering, how did that relate to responsibility? Responsibility seems so intellectual. Well, we looked at that and we said it has to do with the fact that humans, what we regard as the things that we need for our lives are things like our reputation, honor, comfort, ease. And so the temptations of responsibility have to do with protecting our food just as much as the dog. So what we saw with the victory and loss states of responsibility is that they were completely lined up. The victory state was that you do what you say you would do, and that you do what you ought to do, and that you own up to the consequences if you say something, even if you didn't mean it to come out the way it came out. So the victory was yes, and the loss state was no. Completely balanced. You'd think that would be common, but as we've seen in our other traits, this is really the first time that they've lined up just kind of exactly that way. So that was responsibility. And when we finished responsibility, we were at the interesting place where we had now covered a single character trait from each of the 4 groups: the balance, resistance, insight, and empathy. These form an acronym, Brie, like the cheese. I will give you the reference for that with all the references at the end of the course. I don't want you running ahead. I want to give you these character traits in a specific order. And so that's why I'm going to wait for the references till the very end. In the balance, we saw orderliness. In resilience, we saw constancy. In insight, circumspection. In the empathy group, we saw responsibility. Well, today we're going to have another character trait from the balance group: self-control. I think you all have a pretty clear understanding of self-control, so I'm not going to go into it in any great depth. I'm just going to start right out with the little vignettes, the little scenarios that give you an emotional experience of what goes on with self-control. And then we'll talk about it some more right afterwards in the analysis phase. So let's start with our stories. Our first story is Lana's story. The kids got off to school, and Lana was expecting to have a nice, normal morning. She had plans of things she wanted to do, but her plans went off the rail very, very quickly. First thing, wasn't a big deal, but Billy went off without his lunch. Well, she tracked it down. She had to briskly go down to the corner, but The school bus hadn't gotten there yet, so she was able to get Billy his lunch and get back home, still figuring she was going to have her normal morning. And the phone rang. She saw right away that it was Maven. Oh my. So she put on the kettle. She knew how Maven was. And they talked and they talked. Well, I'll tell you, her tea was cold and the cup was empty before Lana was done telling the whole tale of what was going on in her rocky marriage. Well, Lana closed it up by giving her some advice that she knew that Maven would never use. But finally the call was over and she was just starting to pick up her pieces and get ready to start her morning. She hears the garage door opening. She runs to the front room and, yep, there's her husband's car disappearing into the garage. What's going on now? She heads for the kitchen and here he comes in from the garage door into the kitchen and she comes running through. Hon, I got to head off to Phoenix. Would you pack me a bag? At 3 o'clock. Yes, 3 o'clock. Well, he wasn't giving her any more words than that, so she went upstairs. She knew the ropes on that one. She got him a bag ready, packed what she knew he would need. She was getting a little bit upset because this was the third interruption to her morning, but, well, his job was like that. And she knew that's the way his job was. So she calmed herself. She just got everything together, got her peace of mind back, packed his bag, and took it downstairs. Well, by then, he was off the phone. And he said, Hon, could you fix me something to eat? You know what those food lines are like at the airport. By the time I get my food, it's time to get on the flight. I'm not even going to get to eat it. Would you do that for me, hon? And then he immediately turned back to his phone and started making another call. So off she went back into the kitchen. She made him a sandwich to eat on the run, got it all ready for him to go, came back out. Then he dropped the bombshell. Hon, do you suppose you could drop me off at the airport? I hate to leave my car there. She lost it. And the thing that bugged her the most when she was going off on him was that he stood there looking totally puzzled, like he didn't know what was going on. Self-control. Kitty was sitting in her chair at school. Her hand was up. She was wiggling in her chair. Her hand was waving and waving and waving. And the teacher thought, oh no, anybody else? Anybody besides Kitty? But Kitty's hand was the only one up. Okay, she called on Kitty. Whoosh! Came with Kitty, all the stuff she had to say and all she was talking about, and on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Her classmates were looking, they were used to this. Self-control. Dennis was getting ready to write the essay that he needed for his college application. This was a college he really, 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 really wanted to go to, and he wanted to do the best job he could possibly do. So he turned off his computer, he turned off the radio, the stereo, he took his headphones off, he closed his door, got out a piece of paper and a pen, focused completely, and started writing his essay. Self-control. Alice was the best student in the classroom. She was so self-composed, raised her hand politely, spoke briefly, did her homework all the time, perfectly formed letters and numbers, well-spaced. Her papers were a joy to grade. But today wasn't a day for papers and sitting still. The whole class was on a bus. There's a new play park opening, and they were a part of the ribbon cutting ceremony. Her class. How exciting. Her class was chosen for the ribbon cutting ceremony. The mayor was going to be there, and probably some people from the local press. Well, the bus pulled up, and the kids piled out. And when the cue was given, they tore off into the park. Boy, we're trying out all of the different rides. The one that was real attraction, there was a natural hillside to the play park, and there was this wavy slide that went all the way down the hill. Man, that was the one that attracted most of the kids. But Alice was just standing there, kind of eyeing the kids playing. She didn't budge. In fact, she didn't budge when she got off the bus. And the bus driver had to gently walk her inside the fenced area. And when he left her, she didn't budge again. She just stood right there. And the teacher noticed that one of the reporters had spotted Alice and was nudging the guy with the camera. She hurried over to Alice and put her arm around her just in time. Said, "Alice, don't you want to go play?" Her head shake was as firm a no as it was tiny. Self-control. So let's take an analysis of self-control. And let's take a look at the triad of emotions. What's our animal model for the struggle? Our animal model is the wiggly dog. Run here, run there, run there. And the struggle that the dog has is he knows mommy wants him to sit still, so he's trying so hard to sit still, but is he going to make it? It's just as likely that he's going to run off as that he's going to manage to sit there a little bit longer. So that's the animal model. So let's take a look at the pieces of the impulsiveness, of the pieces of self-control when we're talking about human beings. It's divided into a number of pieces. One of them is impulsiveness, impulsive purchases, impulsive behaviors, impulse control in general. It's about talking excessively or too loudly, interrupting other people. And it's also about potentially losing it. So what's going on in the victory state? Is the victory state of self-control sitting there despite the wiggly puppy, looking all around and seeing all the things he wants to run to, but somehow managing to not go? No. The victory state is not 1,000 micro victories over this and that and the next impulse. Our society is loaded with impulses. We have marketing bombarding us from every avenue like never before in our lives. The victory state is one that we actually saw before with a different character trait. We saw the same victory with constancy. The victory state of self-control isn't rigid management of all of the pulls and distractions. The victory state of constancy is managing to move the struggle down to the anchor position, to the point where we can go, or our character can go through life not being pulled by those distractions. That's our victory state of constancy. Well, we are going to find something very unique to this particular triad of self-control. It's something we have never noticed before, and it has to do with the two possible types of anchor. Remember when we talked about the anchor position, we said in general, being anchored has to do with peace and calm, and you've pretty much got things under control. But we pointed out at that time that that word anchor can also sometimes have a negative connotation, the idea of you being weighted down, anchored down. And we see that as a part of every trait that belongs to the, you guessed it, the balance group. Exactly, that's right. And we notice that this down trait, this anchor trait, is not uniformly positive. And we also saw that we have this interesting thing with the wing traits, where we're dealing with a balance, and that is that they're not uniformly negative. We said this was a trait of chaos, but sometimes a little bit of chaos is actually a positive thing. We talked about genius, and we talked about orderliness, where the house was clean enough to be healthy and crazy enough to be happy. So we have this unusual thing with all of the balance variables, but we have something that's really, really unique to this particular triad, and that is the ability for the trait to do a sudden flip from the anchor position to the wing position. We'll study it more in just a little bit when we have a different chart up, but you see this in the extreme case on the evening news, where some horrible tragedy occurs, where someone just totally goes crazy, and then they talk to the neighbors and they say, "Oh, he was always so calm. He was always so quiet. Well, he never made a bit of disturbance. I wonder what happened." Well, these in the tightly wound state, anchor state of self-control, there's the potential for a spring release to the wing state. We have never seen that occur in any of our character traits before. So let's take a look at the lost state of our character trait of self-control. Self-control, as we said, is a balance in the balance group. And the interesting thing about the balance group is that there are two ways to lose it, to go into the lost state. And that has to do with not having enough of it or having too much of it. All of the traits in the balance state have this property that you want a happy medium. So we've seen that before, and we'll see it again with other balance character traits. So let's take a look at the modifiers of self-control. One is scale. We know about scale. I'm not going to go into too much about it here because we've discussed it so many times. Scale has to do with how much is at stake. And you could always up the drama in your story by putting more at stake. When the correct decision, when more weighs in the balance, you've got the power of scale. But we're also dealing with the balance group, and another attribute of the balance group is that agency is always a factor in the balance group. And agency, we said before when we took a look at it, when we were dealing with orderliness, we saw that there were 3 different factors that could affect agency. And we said agency has to do with the character's ability to control their behavior with regard to that trait. And we looked at circumstances before with orderliness. Where might we see circumstances playing a role in agency for self-control? Well, the logical one that really jumps to mind right away is ADHD. ADHD can make it very hard to have self-control. How much sugar a child has eaten, again, that can have a lot to do with self-control. So we see that, yes, circumstances also affect agency in self-control. Limiting self-beliefs. Limiting self-beliefs can operate on both sides of the balance. It's possible for the limiting self-belief to be, I don't think I'm capable of self-control. But the real place where you more often see limiting self-beliefs is on the other side of self-control, the too much side. Because there, the limiting self-beliefs can be things like, I'm not popular enough. I don't deserve to be with that group. I'm not pretty enough. I can't go to that dance. And I've got too much work to do. I don't deserve to take a break. I don't deserve to take time for my writing. Those are the kind of limiting self-beliefs that are much more common to self-control. And the third factor that affects agency is a sense of being overwhelmed. And whenever you're overwhelmed, that can always influence your ability to handle anything where you've got to deal with balance. And in self-control, it's this overwhelm that can really contribute to the wind-up state where the spring gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. So we do see again, and we'll see this again and again with the balance groups, that agency is always a factor in the ability to apply the character trait, but also in the result. Because the interesting thing about these balance traits is when victory is achieved in the balance state, it leads to a sense of self-mastery. And that sense of self-mastery can be transmitted and used for other circumstances. So it's an interesting factor about the balance traits is if someone has trouble with self-control, but they're halfway decent at orderliness, that person can really focus on orderliness and put their space in really nice order, and that can help them with self-control. Because all of these balance traits are interrelated, and that sense of self-mastery carries over to other situations. And it carries over to confidence as well. So that's another side of the agency. Practicing it by a character can give that character. So if you have a story where you're writing a character who has low self-esteem and is struggling, and if you show them achieving success in one of these balance traits, you can motivate their gain of self-control and write that into your story. So now we're going to take a moment to revisit our character profile diagram. And we're going to revisit a part of it that we haven't really been focusing on. We mentioned it as it came up, but we haven't been drilling on it. So we're going to come back and visit it again. And that has to do with these zones of awareness. Many times we keep saying rudder trait, but that is the zone of awareness where the character is fully aware that a struggle is going on and the character is making a choice to the best of their power of agency. We said that the anchor traits were the zone of stability, where by and large the character didn't need to think about it, would probably make the choice to go into the victory state without too much trouble. We saw that the wing state, we called that the zone of chaos. And in the zone of chaos, the character was not so likely to make the choice that would lead to the victory state. Probably wouldn't. And then we learned these two other states. The base state, we said was the base character trait was the state of awareness of what we call being. It's so solid, that trait is so solid that it's more who the character is even than how he behaves. Of course he behaves that way. That's who he is. And likewise, this pinnacle trait was in the zone of aspiration. That was so out of touch, so out of reach of the character that it might as well be unachievable. Except we did know that when we have a story that involves the hero's journey, by golly, he's going to climb up through these traits and achieve the trait that was in the pinnacle trait that was in the zone of aspiration. So that reviews these zones again. But it brings up the last point to be made about the character profile diagram itself. Next week, we're going to start in on how the character profile diagram becomes a character profile tool. So we have a big transition starting next week where the diagram is concerned. But this is the last lesson where we finish what is the character profile diagram. And we noticed, of course, that there were 8 character traits around the rim, but we have 28 in our library. So does that mean that any character only gets at most 8 traits? And the answer is no. We saw 2 sides of it. A very minor character might only get 1 trait. because that's all you need for that character for your story. A main character who's, depending on how involved your story is, might need all 8 positions and might need more. What do I mean by more? It's 2 of our zones. The zone of being and the zone of aspiration are such that any number of character traits can occupy those 2 zones. If you had a character who was the absolute perfect person, that character would have all 28 character traits in the zone of being. Done. In the genre of heroes, superheroes, especially, kung fu type heroes, it's not uncommon for all of the traits in the balance group to be in the state of being, or for the story to be where the young one who's aspiring pushes his last anchor traits into the zone of being. And likewise, if you have a story that's got a super villain, you might find that all of the empathy traits are up here in pinnacle, in the zone of aspiration. So that is the last modifier of our diagram. But while our diagram is up, let's take another look at that ability that we saw that so far is unique to any of the character traits that we've studied. And that is the ability of the self-control to flip from the zone of stability, the anchor, whoosh, up into the wing trait or the zone of chaos. And we saw, they did a couple of examples of like the character who snaps. Wound up tighter than a drum and snaps. That's a very dramatic, very, very dramatic situation. But it's not always a negative. It's not always a negative. If you take, for example, a great musician or a great dancer who has trained and honed their skills through great, great stability with a tremendous anchoredness to their training and their skills, and then comes on stage and is so capable of trusting that when that hand goes out, it's going to hit the right note. When that body leaps, it's going to land in perfect form. And suddenly, that virtuoso can fly on stage, the fingers can fly all over the keyboards, can afford to just go into total abandonment into this majestic performance where everything goes out of trust. The abandonment takes place, and we are in awe of the absolute majesty of the performance. But there's also not just the fact that this can sometimes be a dramatically good thing. There's scale involved in this as well. And that, let's take the minor, scale it way back. We did the majestic performance. Let's scale it back quite a bit. Let's scale it back to the kids. The kids, you took them to the library, and they were so good. They were very self-controlled. And now they've got their books. You put the books in the car, and you let them go out into the park and let it all come out, all that energy they held in while they were in the library. You let it flip up to be a little bit of chaotic running around to the park because the kids needed that release. So that flipping isn't just the big dramatic flipping. It can just be part of the events. And of course, in one of our scenarios, we saw kind of a negative version of it, where we saw that when her husband said, "Can you drop me off at the airport?" That was the last straw for Lana, and she flipped. Afterwards, of course, she would have to apologize. But maybe he ought to apologize too for just assuming that she was going to take care of his every need and not even bother to look at her and say, "Hey, honey, I appreciate the help and the support you're giving me." So I'm not going to just say Lana's in the wrong. Maybe it's my gender. So that is our lesson for this week. We've kind of covered an awful lot, But the thing that I'm so excited about is to let you know about next week's lesson, when we're going to start turning this diagram into a tool. And then we'll see why we're drilling all of these emotions down to the emotional level, and how that's going to ultimately give us the power of living characters. I could read your homework assignment off to you, but it is in the PDF, and you know how they're constructed. It's just going through the states. If you don't want to pick up the PDF, practice and drill with the struggle, with the victory state, with the loss state, and play with it enough so that when you say to yourself, self-control, you've got a set of emotions that come up with you in response, and your less verbal side of your brain is on alert and ready to go ahead with you and be at your service, and to give you energy as you write, because that's one of the things that we're going to see is going to happen when we have the character profile tool. Not only will our characters wake up, but our energy store is going to wake up as well. So thank you very much, and I will see you next week. In the meantime, I'm Kathleen Spracklin, caregiver to the Writer Mom. Oh, and we have a Facebook group now. It's called Writing in the Chaos. You can either search for it by name in Facebook, or you can look in the show notes, and I will include a link to our brand new Facebook group. Love to see you over there. Thank you. Bye-bye.